This is video 9 of the aggregate expenditure model. In the last video you learned about the multiplier, and in the video before that you learned about, at the end of that video we talked about what we call a recessionary gap. So our model is pretty much complete. We have our sig x line, right? The C plus I plus G plus X line. We have disposable income. And just to review, a recessionary gap occurs when our actual GDP, right? So this is our GDP at equilibrium, and the actual GDP is less than potential GDP, and this can occur because of unemployment, for example, right? If we remember through Hawkins' law, we know that if we have a 5% cyclical unemployment, which is the gap between the natural rate of unemployment and the actual unemployment rate, we will have twice that amount in percentage terms for our gap between the GDP, the actual GDP and potential GDP. So this is this case. Right? So in this case, we're worried about a recession because our actual GDP is below potential GDP. And the way we express that is through this recessionary gap, which is the vertical distance, okay? The vertical distance from here to here between the level of consumption that we actually have at potential GDP and the level of consumption that we should have in order to reach potential GDP. So here we have deficient spending. There isn't enough spending in the economy in order to get us to potential GDP. And if our spending were to rise, either through consumption, people consuming more, investment, businesses consuming more, government consuming more, or people consuming more of our products from abroad, then we would have a higher higher aggregate expenditure, and we would bridge that recessionary gap and be able to have enough spending in order to get us to our potential GDP. So that's a recessionary gap. What I want to introduce now is an inflationary gap. Because what if we reverse the situation, right? What if we say that actual GDP is higher than potential GDP, right? So what if we have this situation where our actual GDP is up here, but really potential GDP is here? Okay, and I'll do this in black as well. Okay, so here you have a situation where really what you're worried about is inflation. And the reason you're worried about that is because this is a case where we have too much spending. Okay? What I want you to notice is that at the level of potential GDP, okay, we really should be here. Okay? This should be our equilibrium. Our point of equilibrium should be right there. Okay? But we're at equilibrium right here because there's too much spending in our economy. And we know from demand pull inflation, which is something that we covered earlier, demand pull inflation is a situation where too much spending, too much demand, too much aggregate demand in our economy will end up raising the prices in our economy. And that is something that we want to really be wary of, okay? Because too much too much of an increase in prices can lead to too big of an inflation, and it's not something that we want. And so in this case, what we really want is for a level of spending in our economy, either by households, businesses, government, or people from abroad, to actually lower down, okay? To be lower, in fact, to be this low, right? And so the distance, the vertical distance, right, between the current level of spending and what we actually need spending to be at, so this will be our, C plus I plus G plus X prime, if you will, okay? This difference, and I'll do it in red, let's say, okay? This difference right here is our inflationary gap. It's the vertical distance, okay? And this could be, I don't know, it could be 200 billion, it could be 500 billion, whatever amount we need to lower spending by in order for our economy to be at an equilibrium where we should be at our potential GDP and not above it, as we are in this case. Okay, so let's go back to the example where we have actually a recessionary gap. So let's just do it pretty obvious. So if my actual GDP is below potential GDP, so I know I have a recessionary gap. My recessionary gap, as I said, it's that vertical distance, right? So it's from here to here, right? Now let's put some numbers on it. So let's say that the difference between actual and potential GDP is $1 trillion. Okay, $1 trillion. Okay, that's the GDP gap. Now, in order to bridge that gap, we need, as we said, to increase aggregate expenditure, aggregate spending. And so let's also assume that our marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, right? So this means that every dollar that you get, you will spend 80 cents and you will save 20 cents, right? If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, we know that the multiplier is going to equal 5, okay? And you can revisit your other video in order to understand how I got that. But basically what this means is that an initial increase in spending of an initial increase in spending of 0.2 trillion, because 0.2 trillion is a fifth of 1 trillion, okay? So an initial increase in spending of 0.2 trillion, given a multiplier of 5, will end up increasing our GDP by $1 trillion. And we will move from actual to potential GDP. And how does it look like visually? Well, this is the increase in $0.2 trillion. Okay? And horizontally, we're going to see an increase. So if I draw it in orange or whatever, this increase from here to here, okay, is a $1 trillion increase. Okay? And that's, again, if we're assuming a MPC of 0.8. So a slope of the consumption line of 0.8. Okay, so now I'm going to go over exactly the same example, but in reverse. So now notice that my actual GDP is higher than my potential GDP. So really what I'm worried about now is my inflation, right? And so we're going to have an inflationary gap. And again, the inflationary gap is this vertical distance. And let's say that we're, again, the difference between actual and potential GDP is $1 trillion, okay? It's just that actual is higher than potential at this point. So really what we need to do is we need to decrease spending now. So an initial decrease in spending of $0.2 trillion, assuming a multiplier of 5, okay, will decrease our GDP by 1 trillion. So visually, it just looks like a decrease, right? This is the decrease of $0.2 trillion or $200 billion. And now we're moving basically in this direction, right? Okay, so here's my decrease in $1 trillion. Now, one question that probably comes to your mind is, how can aggregate expenditure increase or decrease in the first place? I mean, what makes it go up or down, right? What actually shifts this curve, right? And so the answer is, well, if, for example, for some reason there's more consumption in our economy, or there's more consumption by businesses, there's more investment. And how would there be more investment? Well, maybe the real interest rate lowered. Or maybe businesses expect things to be really good in the future. Or maybe people expect prosperity in the future and therefore consume more. So C will go up, right? So all these things can change C and I. They could increase. But it turns out that during hard times or during times where the economy is overheating, sometimes the government needs to intervene, okay? And the government will also be able to shift it up or down, right? The aggregate expenditure curve. And so now next video, we're going to learn how the government intervenes and helps us move the consumption line, the aggregate expenditure line.